Hello everyone, and welcome to Hallow World. This is a horror narration channel where all the stories are written and narrated by a human. If you like the video, please like and subscribe. It'll really help the channel.
Today's story is called Blood in the Meadow. Please enjoy.
I told you we should have stopped at the last place, Tim whined.
We'll be fine, Jake assured him. You worry too much. He glanced down at the fuel gauge on his 2018 Toyota Tacoma. It was on E and the gas light was lit. He really hoped they'd be fine. They were getting close to the campsite, and he knew there was a gas station there for hikers and campers to refuel before they headed out. He had been to this campsite years before with his grandfather. He remembered a rundown old convenience store with a lazy fat cat laying behind the counter. Then they rounded a curve, and there it was. Green Meadows Campgrounds, with a rundown old gas station right by the gravel entrance. Good timing, Jake laughed as the engine began to sputter. He put it in neutral and rolled gently up to a pump. Tim stared at him angrily. What? Jake laughed again. I told you we'd be fine. Yeah, barely, Tim retorted. He looked like he had a few more things he wanted to say, but Jake hurriedly opened his door and jumped out. The pumps were old with a paper sign taped to each one that read, "Pay inside." Jake heard the passenger door close behind him as he sauntered towards the little store. Wait for me, dude, Tim said as he fell in beside Jake. Jake and Tim had been best friends since 4th grade, and they had both just graduated from Marshall University. Before heading out into the workforce for the rest of their lives, the pair had decided to take one final camping trip deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The super secluded spot Jake's granddad had taken him to had really seemed like the perfect spot. A little bell over the door jingled as the young men walked into the store. It looked about how you would expect a tiny, rundown convenience store to look. Tons of Slim Jims and no fruit. A grizzled old man sat perched on a stool behind the dirty counter, and Jake's eyes widened when he saw a fat, lazy cat sleeping in a cat bed on the floor behind the man. Hey sir, Jake called out. How old's that cat? I could have sworn I saw him here about 12 years ago.
No one knows, really, the old man growled. He showed up one day about 20 years ago, and he was already fat. So, could be a little over 20, maybe more.
The man shrugged.
There's no way that cat's over 20,
Tim whispered, leaning towards Jake as they grabbed drinks from the coolers on the back wall. Crazy old man, he grumbled. They walked up to the counter, and Jake grabbed some beef jerky, throwing it on the counter as he said, "Need to fill up the Toyota as well." The old man grunted and rang the men up for the drinks and snacks.
Pump's on, just pay when you're done,
the man said. Jake and Tim walked out to the truck and started snacking on the jerky while Jake pumped his gas. The sun was starting to set already. You want to just camp here tonight, set out early in the morning? Tim asked. Jake looked at the sunset a moment before answering. Yeah, probably should. Gonna be a rough hike. Gonna want to make it as far as we can tomorrow. Meadow site's about a day and a half, maybe close to 2 days hike if we take our time, Jake said. Tim blew out a long breath. It better be worth it, Jake, I swear, man, Tim grumbled. Jake laughed. It's incredible, I promise, Jake retorted. That night, they spent some time walking around, meeting other campers before they set up their tent for the night. There's a handful of young families just trying to get away from the city for a day or two, as well as a few couples. Everyone seemed very friendly, but a little on edge as well. The energy amongst the campers felt a little off. As they were setting up their tent, a ranger walked up and greeted the young men. How's it going there, fellas? The ranger called out as he approached with one hand tucked behind his belt buckle. Good, they both answered. Glad to hear it, the ranger said as he stopped by their tent. Have you all been here before? Once, years ago, Jake answered. Okay, well, I just want to make sure y'all know to stay on the trails at all times, okay? People go missing around here all the time. It's very easy to get turned around in these mountains, and there's a good chance you'll never be found, so no wandering off, understood? Yes, sir, understood, Jake replied as Tim glared over at him. It'll be fine, Jake whispered to Tim as the ranger walked away. Yeah, I'm sure it'll be fine. The same way everything is always fine, Tim leered. They finished setting up their tent and crawled inside to go to sleep for the night. The early morning light found Jake and Tim trudging through dense, foggy woods. They had set off before dawn, having planned the first leg of the journey the night before. Green Meadows had a number of hiking trails labeled by difficulty. Some of them led to other campers' grounds, while some simply looped back around to the entrance site. The trail the boys were on was labeled as moderately difficult, and it led far up into the mountains. At the end of it was a campsite named Shadow Valley Campsite, nestled in a valley between two peaks. If they didn't waste too much time during their hike, then Jake and Tim should be able to get to that campsite before sundown. The trail was about 10 miles uphill through rough terrain, but the boys were both experienced hikers. Once they reached Shadow Valley, it was about a half-day's hike to the Meadow site. They would spend a day there before heading back. The total trip would take them about 4 days. A day of hiking to the valley site, then a half day to the meadow, 24 hours at the meadow, then a half day hike back to the valley. Finally, a full day hike back to the entrance site. A rough journey, but one Jake and Tim had been thoroughly looking forward to. Throughout the first day's hike, Jake and Tim kept up a playful banter. They chatted about their future plans, reminisced about college memories, and, of course, talked about women. Even in the rough terrain, with the summer heat threatening to suffocate them, both men were thoroughly enjoying themselves. Around noon, they stopped for lunch. Jake sat on a rock by a small babbling brook and pulled a neatly wrapped sandwich from his bag. "Man, this is something, isn't it?" he asked. "Just like I remember it. It's so beautiful up here." Tim grunted in agreement as he splashed his neck with cool water from the brook. "Yeah, it's something all right," Tim said. Then he paused and looked around. "Man, it is really quiet though." "I know," Jake smiled. "Isn't it great? You forget how noisy it is in town until you get way out like this." "No, I mean..." Tim's voice trailed off as he looked up into the treetops. "There's really nothing. No birds, squirrels. I don't think I've even heard a single insect for a while now." Jake frowned and cocked his head, listening for a few moments. "Yeah, that's pretty weird," he said as he hurriedly finished his sandwich. "Maybe that means there's a storm coming or something. We should get moving." With that, the pair continued up the trail, Tim eating his sandwich as they hiked. The woods remained eerily quiet for the rest of the hike, but the sky stayed clear. They found the valley campsite just before sunset. There was one other tent already set up at the site, and a long-haired, dirty older man in a green flannel shirt sat at a picnic table, looking up at the sky. He looked at Jake and Tim in surprise when they walked into the campsite. "Ho there," the man called out. "Rare to see anyone this far up." He chuckled as the boys dropped their packs and flopped onto the bench opposite the man in exhaustion. "Heck of a hike, ain't it?" the man asked. "Yeah, we were pushing to make sure we had light to set up our tent tonight," Jake panted. "How long have you been up here?" "Oh, I'm up here all the time," the man replied. "Most of the time, it's just me, though some folks do still make it up here from time to time. The name's Buddy, by the way," the man said. Jake and Tim introduced themselves and then told Buddy they were going to set up their tent. "Oh, let me help you with that," Buddy insisted. After they got the tent set up, Jake started a fire and put a pot on. He threw some freeze-dried soup into the pot with water and brought it to a simmer. Buddy was fascinated by the soup. "Freeze-dried, you say?" Buddy wondered aloud, rubbing his chin. Jake scooped some into a bowl for him, and they all chowed down. "Wow-wee, kid, this is incredible," Buddy exclaimed as he slurped down the soup. Jake laughed and thanked him. It was a fairly simple recipe, to be fair. That night, the three men sat around the fire for a few hours, telling stories and laughing. Jake stared at the stars and thought about his grandfather. He had sat at this same spot 12 years ago and looked at these same stars with him. Then Jake's brow creased as he remembered something. Well, half remembered, really. Hadn't there been a man wearing plaid in this campsite back then, too? What was his name? He looked over at Buddy, talking and laughing with Tim, and thought he must not be remembering right. It was a long time ago, after all. Then Buddy turned to Jake and asked, "So, are y'all heading back down in the morning?" Jake shook his head and explained that they were hiking up to the Meadow site. Buddy sat and stared at Jake for a few moments, not saying anything. "What?" Jake asked. Buddy's strange look was making him uncomfortable. I don't think that's a good idea, Jake, Buddy said quietly. What? Why not? Jake asked. Buddy sighed and stared into the fire for a few moments before responding. Things happen in the meadow. Things I can't explain. I steer clear of it, and I'd advise anyone else to do the same. Well, I've been there before, Jake said. At this, Buddy looked up at Jake in surprise. My grandfather took me 12 years ago. Buddy's eyes bore into Jake, but Jake refused to look away. All right, well, if you insist. Not like I could stop you. Buddy turned and stared into the fire. The atmosphere seemed fairly subdued after that, and it wasn't long before the boys said goodnight to Buddy and crawled into their tent. The next morning, Jake and Tim woke up before the sun and brewed some coffee. Buddy was already up and overjoyed that they were willing to share some of their coffee with him. They hit the trail as the sun's first rays were just beginning to peek through the trees. The hike only lasted a few hours, but it was eerily silent the entire way. Around midday, they finally broke through the woods and walked into a large sunny meadow filled with wildflowers. This is it, Jake yelled, and he took off running into the meadow. Tim lagged behind him, but couldn't keep himself from grinning as his best friend pranced, hooting and hollering through the beautiful meadow. It's just as beautiful as I remember, Jake said as he ran up to Tim. It's very pretty, I'll give you that, Tim said as he looked around. In the middle of the meadow was a small, clear blue pond. The bottom was made up of round, smooth rocks, and the water was so crystal clear that you could easily see to the bottom. There were no fish in the pond, he noticed. In fact, he realized he didn't see any bugs in it, or even around it either. He looked around the meadow. There were tons of every kind of wildflower you could think of, but not a single insect as far as he could see or hear. It's kind of weird though, right? Tim asked. Jake shrugged and replied, You worry too much, Tim. It'll be fine. It's a beautiful place. Let's just try to enjoy ourselves. They started setting up their tent right by the little pond. A gentle breeze rippled across the field of flowers and made the pond babble quietly as tiny waves lapped gently against the rocks. When they were done setting up their tent, Jake dug a fire pit and started a small fire to cook on. They ate some fried spam and crackers for lunch. After their meal, they sat looking at the scenery for a while. The view was breathtaking. Hey man, Tim said after a while. Jake looked over at him expectantly. Are you scared at all? Of what? Jake laughed. This meadow? Looks pretty peaceful to me. No, Tim said. I mean after this. We'll go get jobs in the corporate world, work different places. Our lives will just go on without each other. I mean, I know we'll still be friends, but it'll be different, right? Jake nodded slowly. Yeah, it'll be different. They fell silent again as they looked out over the meadow with the perfect little pond. Hey, Jake, Tim said, chuckling. Remember in 8th grade when Tommy Stacks pantsed me in the hallway? Jake laughed. Yeah, and then I pantsed him, and he wasn't wearing underwear. The boys laughed harder, tears forming in their eyes. And everyone was so shocked at seeing him butt naked, no one even noticed me pulling my pants back up. Tim laughed uproariously. Jake wiped a tear from his eye. Yeah, man, good times. Good times, Tim repeated. They spent the rest of the afternoon reminiscing about the childhood they had experienced together and were now leaving behind. After sunset, Jake pulled out some well-wrapped meat that they had been saving for this night. 2 juicy ribeye steaks that had been pre-cooked and wrapped went into Jake's cast iron skillet, along with some herbs and potatoes. Soon, they were feasting like kings. They both agreed it was the best meal of their lives. After dinner, Jake suddenly got a mischievous look on his face. Hey man, fancy a dip? He asked as he started stripping off his clothes in the warm summer air. Tim looked at him, then looked over at the little pond. Something about it didn't sit right with him. He shook off the feeling though and joined Jake as they ran hollering into the water. The water was perfectly cool and felt so good on his skin that Tim thought it almost seemed to energize him. The water seemed to be a bit deeper than they had thought in the middle, maybe about 6 feet by Jake's estimation. Considering Jake was 6 feet tall and the water just cleared his head if he stood on the bottom, Tim thought this was a pretty good estimate. They swam for a while under the stars, but soon they were both floating and staring up into the sky. Perfect day, Jake said. Perfect day, Tim agreed. They changed into fresh underwear and hung the wet clothes up to dry before retiring to their tent for the night. Tim had a hard time falling asleep at first. His mind kept wandering back to the strange silence of the mountain the last few days, as well as the strange feeling of the pond water. Eventually, he fell asleep listening to Jake's rhythmic breathing across the tent from him. The big idiot had always been a fast and heavy sleeper. Tim awoke with a start sometime later. It was pitch black in the tent, but moonlight began to fill the space as the tent's zipper was slowly opened. Tim's heart jumped into his throat and he tried to yell, but no sound came out. He tried to move, but he was frozen. Then, a blonde head came poking through the tent flap. It was a woman. As far as he could tell in the low light, she was beautiful. She entered the tent slowly and crawled towards Tim. Tim's heart raced as he watched helplessly. She was close enough now that Tim could see that she was exquisitely beautiful, with blonde hair and large breasts, which showed prominently through her low-cut gown. Tim was terrified and yet strangely aroused. He tried again to move or call for help, but once again, he found himself to be completely frozen. The woman had reached his sleeping bag now, and she began to slowly crawl over him. Her face inched closer and closer to his. Tim felt himself relaxing. She obviously meant him no harm, and he was about to have the night of his life with her. Suddenly, Jake's fist smashed against the woman's beautiful face and sent her reeling backwards. "Come on!" Jake screamed as he pulled Tim out of his sleeping bag and passed the screeching woman towards the tent flaps. Tim caught a glimpse of her in the moonlight as they passed, and he almost fainted. In place of the beautiful blonde with the large breasts, there flailed a snarling and grotesque old hag. Her skin looked to be made of leather, and her worn old face could not have ever been pretty. The two men barreled out of the tent and fell into the moonlit meadow. The pond nearby was glowing a bright blue, and would have been beautiful if it wasn't also terrifying. "We gotta run!" Jake yelled, and the pair took off at a dead sprint towards the trail. "What the hell is happening, Jake?" Tim yelled as they ran. "I had forgotten," Jake yelled back. His words made Tim's blood run cold. "When I came here with my granddad, she attacked us then too. I guess she looked hot to Grandpa, but she just looked like an evil old witch to me. I hit her, and it was like he woke up. He shot her, and then she took off, so we left." "I didn't bring a gun!" Tim yelled. "Me neither. I figure we should just run. There's no way she can keep up." The two men ran for a few more minutes before slowing down, panting and gasping for breath. "Okay, we should have a good enough head start. We should just head right back to the valley," Jake said. Tim was bent over with his hands on his knees, still gasping. He had never been as athletic as Jake. He nodded in agreement and they continued down the trail at a brisk walk. After a while, Tim spoke up. "Man, we left our packs, our food, everything." "I know," Jake answered, "but I think we had to. There's something really wrong with that old lady. When I saw her, all I could think about was getting away." Tim nodded. "Yeah, I was frozen. I couldn't even yell. She was really hot at first, though." Jake grunted in amusement. "See, that's the thing," he said. "I think you and my granddad saw her as hot because of some sort of power. But whatever it is, doesn't work on me." Tim thought it over for a while and realized that was the only thing that made sense. Suddenly, Jake stopped walking. "What the?" Jake muttered. "What's wrong?" Tim asked. Jake gestured in front of him. "Where's the trail?" Tim looked around and gasped. Usually the trail was easy to see. Plus, trees were marked with paint and plastic ribbon to help hikers not get lost. As he looked around them now, Tim couldn't see the trail, but he also didn't see any marked trees. "Oh no," Tim whispered. "No, no, no, no." These mountains were absolutely not a place you would want to get lost. Suddenly, there was a large cracking sound in the woods behind them. This was followed by the snapping of a lot of smaller branches, as well as the crunching of dead leaves and pine needles. It sounded like something big was approaching them quickly from behind. "Run!" Jake yelled. Tim did not need to be told twice. They took off at a dead sprint. Jake had no idea where they were, but he knew they needed to go east and a little south to the valley. He tore through the underbrush, pushing limbs away from his face as he ran. He felt a dozen tugs and tears as thorns grasped at his face, his hands, and his clothing. He heard Tim right behind him and knew that if they lived or died, it would be on him. Behind Tim, they could hear something huge tearing through the brush after them. It sounded like it was ripping up the smaller trees completely, and it was making a strange and terrifying snorting sound. It also sounded like it was getting closer. Jake knew they had to try to hide and let it pass, so he began to look for any kind of a dip or hole or bank, anything that they could hide behind. Then he saw it. He slid down the steep bank of what looked like an old creek bed and shimmied under a little alcove that had been washed away from some tree roots. Tim almost ran past him, but Jake reached out and caught him, yanking him down into the alcove beside him. The boys shushed each other as they tried to calm their breathing, but then they both fell dead silent out of pure fear when they saw what was chasing them. They heard it crashing through the brush, and possibly loud now as they approached their hiding spot. When it finally burst into their field of view, the pair couldn't believe their eyes. Dimly lit by the moonlight was a giant monstrosity straight from a fairy tale. It didn't seem to have a head, just a giant rounded torso. It did have a face though, and it was terrifying. Two bright red eyes set deep into the monster's flat face, and a huge circular mouth filled with rows upon rows of sharp, jagged teeth. It had long arms that hung down by its relatively short legs, but instead of hands, it had huge claws. As they watched, it suddenly stopped on the old creek bed, mere feet away from them. It raised its head and looked around as if sniffing the air, even though it didn't have a nose that they could see. It started making those snorting sounds again, and began to spin around frantically looking for the boys. Suddenly, there was a shout nearby. The creature's head snapped towards the sound, and it took off at great speed, tearing through the brush with its massive claws.
Oh my god.
Tim gasped as he leaned forward, shaking uncontrollably.
Why's that, Jake?
No idea, Jake responded. He was trying to catch his breath as well. I definitely didn't see that last time. He stumbled out of their hiding spot and gestured to Tim. Come on, we gotta get some distance while that thing is distracted. They took off at a jog, heading in what they hoped was the right direction. The trail was still nowhere to be found.
Hey, who do you think that was back there? Tim asked. You know, the shout? You think someone saw that thing, or just a lucky coincidence?
This far out? I'm not sure, but people are pretty rare, I think. Most people don't even go as far as the valley, and it seems like almost no one goes to the meadow. It would be a pretty huge coincidence. They jogged on in silence for a few minutes, listening for the creature. They hadn't heard it since it took off after whoever shouted. Suddenly, a man came darting out of the trees in front of them. Jake almost had a heart attack, but he recognized Buddy in the dim moonlight. "This way!" Buddy yelled, waving to the boys. "Buddy?" Jake and Tim both said incredulously. "No time, come on!" Buddy yelled back, and he turned and ran back into the trees. The boys hurried after him, trying to follow glimpses of green flannel in the dark green forest. Suddenly, they found themselves back on the trail. There was a mile marker nearby that read, Valley Campsite, 0.5 miles. Jake couldn't believe their luck. He looked over and realized Buddy was walking beside them. "You're safe now," Buddy said. "The valley is protected." Jake felt like his head would explode with questions, but he walked in silence for some time. After a few minutes, they walked into the valley campsite, and Jake fell onto a bench at a nearby picnic table. His head was spinning, and he felt nauseous. Then he heard Tim ask what he hadn't been able to yet.
"What the heck was that thing?"
Tim asked.
"Why was it chasing us? And how did you get rid of it?"
Tim was shaking all over, and he looked like he would collapse any moment. But he stood his ground and glared at Buddy. Buddy sighed and looked up at the stars for a few moments before he answered. There's a witch that lives in the meadow. She lies in wait and eats unwary hikers. That's the short version, at least. As for the creature, it's a sort of golem she creates from the forest and shadow. If it had caught you, it would have taken you back to her to be eaten. The boys looked at him with stunned expressions. As for how I got rid of it, well, I simply distracted it, and then countered the magic she used to trap you in a lost loop. You would have never escaped, no matter how far you ran, so the spell had to be undone. Not overly complicated magic, but it's just about at the limit of my powers these days. Jake and Tim continued to stare at him dumbfounded. If they hadn't seen the witch and the golem for themselves, they would have thought he was a crazy old man. It was you, Jake said suddenly. I remember now, 12 years ago. You were here back then too. Then the witch found us, and we ran and we got lost. And then you showed us the way. He couldn't believe he had forgotten his savior from back then. But then he also couldn't believe he had forgotten any of it. Yes, Buddy said. She makes you forget. There's a spell on the whole mountain. A strong and ancient magic that protects witches of the wild. Makes them almost impossible to hunt, you see. Jake shook his head in confusion. This is just... Jake began, emotions threatening to take his voice from him. This is so much. Buddy nodded and looked up at the stars, pretending not to notice Jake's tears. How long have you been here? Tim asked. A very, very long time, Buddy replied. I came here maybe 200 years ago or so, hunting this witch. She bested me, and I died in her domain. At that, both boys looked up at him startled. Yes, I'm what you might call a ghost, Buddy said nonchalantly. Yeah, why not? Tim muttered. We've seen everything else today. Buddy chuckled and continued. As I was dying, I managed to activate a failsafe spell that I had set here in the valley. It kept my spirit from leaving the mortal plane, but I am also now tethered to this site. I cannot travel more than a mile or two from it. Best I can do now is try to convince people not to go to the meadow. Can't exactly tell them why, though. But this site, it's protected? Jake asked. Yes, for now at least. My powers are diminishing over time. But as long as you are here, she cannot get to you. Not tonight, at least. Tomorrow, though, you will need to brave the mountain if you're going to return home. And, of course, the mountain is her domain. I will try to distract her when you leave, but it will be a dangerous journey all the same. Jake felt like he was having a panic attack. He tried to keep his breathing under control. There's only a few hours until sunrise. You should get what rest you can, Buddy said. Jake nodded, but he wasn't sure he would ever be able to sleep again. He suddenly realized that he and Tim were both barefoot and wearing only the gym shorts and undershirts that they had slept in. They had no tent or bags. Everything had been left behind. Do you have any shoes, Buddy? He asked, although he felt silly asking a dead man for footwear. To his surprise, Buddy had a stash of old boots and shoes in his tent. The tent had been left by unfortunate hikers, as well as all the shoes over the years, he explained. Sometimes he would find them in the woods where someone had been taken, and the shoes were left in the scuffle, or sometimes they were simply left behind like Jake's and Tim's boots had been. The boys each found a pair that somewhat fit them, and then laid down in the grass near the picnic table. They were both terrified, but vowed to try to sleep so they wouldn't be a burden to the other on the dangerous trek home in the morning. Jake's mind raced, but then he blinked and it was morning. He had passed out from exhaustion at some point. If he had to guess, he'd say he had slept about 3 hours. Now the sun's first rays were starting to peek over the horizon, and he knew it was time. Buddy stood near the trail leading down the mountain. As they were walking out, he nodded at them and said, "Good luck, gentlemen. I'll do everything I can for you, I promise." Jake and Tim felt reassured by the man's earnest vow. As they left the campsite, Jake felt a tangible feeling of passing through a sort of energy barrier. On the other side, the feelings of peace and warmth left his body completely. He could feel that he was in danger. He exchanged a glance with Tim, who obviously felt it too. They both broke into a jog. It would be a long day, but if they could maintain a brisk walk or light jog the majority of the day, they should be back at the entrance camp by mid-afternoon. They jogged for what felt like an hour or so before they heard anything unnatural. Suddenly, they heard the snorting and huffing of the golem some ways behind them. They glanced at each other again and picked up the pace. The golem must have heard them or smelled them, because suddenly it was crashing through the trees right in their direction. Jake swore under his breath and began to sprint down the trail, Tim right behind him. He thought for a moment that they were lucky to still be able to see the trail at least. No sooner had he thought that, when the trail suddenly disappeared. Jake cursed again and kept running in what he hoped was vaguely the right direction. As long as we keep running downhill, we should be fine, he thought. He tried not to think about what Buddy had told them about being stuck in a lost loop. They could hear that the golem was gaining on them again, and Jake began to panic. At this rate, it seems like they wouldn't escape. Then, Buddy appeared out of thin air behind them with a clap of furious thunder. The golem came tearing out of the trees and swiped at the elderly man, but Buddy waved his hands and a bolt of lightning shot out from them and smashed into the golem's face. It crumpled to the ground and lay still. Buddy turned to the boys and yelled, "Go!" Jake and Tim obeyed, dashing headlong into the trees again. Behind them, they could hear a woman begin to screech and wail, followed by Buddy's thunderous voice and more crashes of lightning. Jake heard a profound snap, like someone snapped their fingers in his ear, and suddenly they were back on the trail. Gasping for air, Jake and Tim stumbled down the path and tried to keep up a vigorous pace. Wait, Tim gasped, slowing to a walk. "I'm sorry, Jake. I can't keep running." "Yes, you can," Jake insisted, grabbing Tim's sleeve and dragging him along. Tim reluctantly continued jogging. Jake knew they couldn't keep up a dead sprint for long, but he was worried about the distance they still had to go. Suddenly, Jake heard a woman cackling in the trees nearby.
"Come on, sweet things. I just want a taste,"
the voice called out. Jake's blood ran cold, and he looked over at Tim. Tim had stumbled to a halt, urine running down his legs. His eyes were wide in terror, his mouth agape. He looked like he would faint from the fear. Jake suddenly realized he could barely move. His body was shaking, his knees were weak. He realized he was crying and tried to reach for Tim. Then he saw the golem stomp out of the trees behind Tim. It was cold, evil, and unstoppable. It walked up behind Tim and stopped just for a moment. "No! Please!" Jake screamed, but the golem ignored him. Tim's eyes met Jake's, just as the golem's claws burst from his chest. Jake screamed in terror and anguish. Tim's mouth was open, but no sound came out. The golem picked Tim up and stuffed him into its mouth. Blood sprayed from between the rows of jagged teeth. And then Tim was gone. Jake fell to his knees and sobbed. Then he heard the old crone's voice.
"You can go now, boy. I'm too full to eat you now. That idiot wizard really filled me up. Don't worry, sweetheart. You'll be back one day. You'll forget about me, but you'll remember your friend who died. You see, you'll come back to remember him, to hike the trail where he was lost. That's when I'll eat you. So get good and fat before then, okay?"
She cackled again, and then she was gone. Jake lay sobbing on the trail until he passed out. When Jake woke up, he was being carried by the ranger he had met at the entrance campsite. The ranger looked down and said very seriously, "Oh, good, you're awake. Are you alright, son?" Jake looked around. They were walking through the entrance campsite towards a small building with a red cross on it. "My friend," Jake whispered through cracked lips. "He's gone. She killed him." Tears began to roll slowly down his face again. The ranger looked down at him with concern. "What friend, kid? You were alone when I met you." Jake spent the rest of the day in bed, hooked to an IV and answering questions. He learned that the ranger had found him only about a mile from the entrance site, unconscious and dehydrated. No matter who Jake asked, no one seemed to remember Tim. They all insisted that he had been alone when he arrived at camp days before. Eventually, Jake was able to leave the camp and drove home. He spent years talking about his friend Tim, but he was the only one who ever remembered him. Tim's family didn't even know who Jake was talking about. They also acted like they had never met Jake before, even though he had spent countless nights at their house growing up. The years went by, and Jake began to forget. He never forgot Tim, but when he thought about him, all he could remember was that a good friend of his had died on that mountain. One night, Jake was staring into his fireplace, a beer perched on his large belly. "I really should go back," he muttered. "See where we were when he died. It was really beautiful there,